Welcome to the Peacebuilding Practitioner, a resource page and podcast for people working on conflict, on peacebuilding, and on social justice issues. My name is Björn Eser, and I'm the founder of and shaker and maker behind the Peacebuilding Practitioner. Welcome back to Season 3 of the Peacebuilding Practitioners podcast. Season 3 is all about digital peacebuilding, this highly complex, tremendously exciting, often messy and quickly developing intersection where emerging technologies and the digital world on the one hand and conflict transformation, peacebuilding, human rights and social justice work on the other hand meet. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Anne-Marie Buzatu. She's the Executive Director of ICT4Peace Foundation. By training, you're a lawyer, and I think you have 20 plus years of experience, especially around humanitarian law, and you have an in-depth understanding of emerging challenges to human rights, international human rights law and security policy on the one hand, and the cyber domain and emerging technologies on the other hand. That is exactly what we need today. So welcome, Anne-Marie. It's great having you on the show.
Thank you so much, Bjorn. It's great being here today.
Yeah, great. I mean, I gave this little introduction and I had the pleasure of meeting you about half a year ago and we had in-depth discussions about plenty of coffee. But maybe can you, just before we get started, say a few more words about yourself, your background and your current position and role in ICT4Peace, and then we take it from there.
Sure. So, well, as you mentioned, my background is in international law, specifically international humanitarian law and human rights law. And I have worked for quite some time in that domain. But I also have this little detour in my career where I actually worked in the IT sector as a web developer and a database administrator, which certainly gives me a little bit more of an understanding of the fundamentals of technology, kind of what is possible, even though I'm not keeping up to date with everything, although I keep up with some things, still having that basis really helps to understand better how to translate law to that domain and vice versa. And that's one of the things that we do at ICT4Peace. We really try to make that translation between new technologies, emerging technologies, the opportunities and benefits, as well as the challenges, and how they translate to law, to policymakers, to that side, multilateral discussions. So it's really in that area, that kind of sweet spot between technology and policy and law, that we act, and we work with a view to really promoting both a safe and secure cyberspace, as well as the peaceful use of new technologies. So in a nutshell, that's what we're doing.
That's in a nutshell great, and great to hear. I mean, with the wealth of experiences you come to that field, it's great. And I ran a few interviews over the last couple of days, and very much they were partly on practical, hands-on, community-based work. We looked some at the research work, and it's great to now be able to talk about policy, and policy at quite a high level. When I prepared for this interview, I obviously had a look at the ICT4Peace Foundation website, and on your website, it states, and let me quote here, that's a bit longer, but I think that is probably something that also encourages people to go and actually open their browser and check that out. It says, ICT4Peace is a policy and action-oriented international foundation, as you just said. The purpose is to save lives and protect human dignity through information and communication technology. Great. Since 2003, ICT4Peace explores and champions the use of ICTs and new media for peaceful purposes, including for peacebuilding, crisis management, and humanitarian operations. If I read that, that sounds great. If I now look at your day-to-day work, how does this actually translate in what you and your team are doing on a day-to-day, month-to-month, quarterly basis?
Well, thank you for reading that. And as you noted, we have been around for quite some time. I just would, as a quick aside, say that ICT4Peace is really the result of the UN WSIS conferences that took place in 2003 in Geneva and 2005 in Tunis, which were really the first times that the UN tackled this issue head on. But what does that translate? And over those, nearly 20 years, what does that mean? And what are we doing now? And so we really work in a few areas. One is policy research and technology research. So the idea is to understand and even identify, anticipate what emerging developments in technology could translate into policy terms in a near and medium term. And so one thing that has really characterized our work at ICT4Peace is identifying and raising awareness about new things that are coming down the technology pipeline that could really cause challenges or even opportunities. Sometimes there are opportunities and technology.
Hopefully,
I'm
yeah.
a technology optimist. So, but how can the international community, how can political actors on the national and international levels really take into account these new developments so that they can build them into their own policy and law work? So that's one thing that we do. Another thing that we do is we work with different policymakers directly or with parliamentarians sometimes. We provide targeted advice. We provide opinions on different areas of law or draft resolutions or different kinds of negotiations to say, this is our point of view. And one of the things that we try to do is really bring the civil society perspective to these policy and decision makers. What does it mean on the ground for people? And not just for someone like me based in Geneva, Switzerland, but maybe somebody who is based in a rural area in many countries all over the world that don't have good access to technology, that maybe are not as far advanced, but who are increasingly getting on board with these new technologies. So we try to bring a perspective that reflects what the user's experiences are and where there are threats, also where there are different, whether it's phishing, different kinds of cyber attacks, a crime, or difficulties having access. So that's another area that we work in. And then a third area that we work in and that we're quite active in is capacity building.
Yeah.
I think that building capacity is one of the most important things that needs to be done in this domain. We were talking a little bit earlier, that we work a lot with international policymakers and try to educate them or, build their capacity in these areas around law, policy, what it means, what these new technologies mean for that. How can we work within the international community to tackle the challenges and respond and then amplify the really good parts? But, that also takes me back to one thing that I think is really important, and maybe we'll talk about, is just generally having an awareness of how to use these technologies. And I think most of us, we got a smartphone or in front of a screen and said, use it, but we didn't have an education on how to use it responsibly. And I think that that's one of the things that we are really grappling with right now, as we see a lot of what you could maybe characterize irresponsible use of technologies or things like misinformation, disinformation, is the fact that there's not even a kind of baseline of education that's required. Now, certainly some schools are doing it. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I don't think it's translated into really part of our basic curriculum of education. And then there are a bunch of us that came of age before these technologies really became ubiquitous. And then we're trying to learn now. And so I think that that's one of the big challenges that we have, all of us as users, because in some ways we are also the biggest vulnerabilities in these technologies. We are a vector that for different types of attacks.
So many points that resonate with me right away. Having certain skills and having that inbuilt into our curricula at school from an early age. And I think, yes, there are individual teachers who really do a great job, but it normally rests the responsibility or the joy about addressing these issues normally rests with individuals, but it's not institutionalized. And another thing, I recently spoke with a parliamentarian here from the Green Party who's very much into data protection and AI, and also the potential, but also the threats and what does it mean in legal terms. And he also speaking to other parliamentarians. And in Germany, parliamentarians are not the oldest, but on average, I think they are, older generation. And he also said, asking the question, if you say, what's our understanding of engaging with the digital world and understanding the underlying concepts? And he said, normally it's the generation which started with email and Facebook and very often stopped with email, Facebook, and maybe Instagram. And that doesn't mean that's bad, but it's only one side of the story and it doesn't go deep enough. And in terms of media literacy, obviously understanding the producer side, what are the algorithms behind it? What are the chances? What are the risks? But also responsible use kind of on the consumer side. And I think there's plenty of room for improvement, so to speak.
Indeed.
Talking about media literacy, maybe let's get started with that right away. You just mentioned misinformation and disinformation. For someone who's not on a daily basis dealing with that, what's the difference between them? And why is it relevant understanding it?
Well, there's a very basic difference between misinformation and disinformation. Both of them are kinds of information that could mislead or, provoke a strong reaction, which there tend to be false information or information that's used in a way to deceive. The difference between the two of them is that disinformation is purposeful. It is constructed with the intent to deceive, to create this kind of, misunderstanding, say, misuse of information. Whereas misinformation is usually the unconscious sharing, or not, sharing it without a particular intent to deceive, just that you haven't verified it, perhaps. You're just sharing it because you think it sounds right or you like it. You really believe that it's true, but you probably haven't done the kind of research to check whether that information is correct. So, but that's where you see a lot of information going viral. So this information will be typically the initial kind of information that's put out on, say, different social media platforms with this intent to deceive. And then misinformation is that when people say, oh, I share, I forward, and then it goes, much more quickly, viral, as they say.
Yeah. If we look back at recent years, obviously this whole thing, misinformation, disinformation, has played a huge role in some of the very violent conflicts we see at the moment, we've seen in the last couple of years. If you look at your work, have you dived deeper into how is the relationship and how does it influence the dynamics between misinformation and disinformation on the one hand, and on policy work and how to counter it from state as well as non-state civil society actors on the other hand? And if you looked at it, are there any insights which are worth sharing, which we should know?
It's a very complex, obviously, topic, and we have looked at it in some depth. Just to say, first of all, and we have found in our research and also have done capacity building in this area, identified different kinds of this, let's say, you could say this, some people call this information disorder, this wrongful information has, for example, exacerbated division within societies, has escalated violence and conflicts. Maybe there's a strong reaction, people fleeing or attacking, or in any case, because of information that they get online. So it absolutely has a strong impact on conflict dynamics. Now, how to counter it? Unfortunately, this is a much more complicated process. It's not just something that you can do, like with a silver bullet. There are some, I would say, relatively straightforward ways that have been used with some success. And this is sometimes if you get a personality who has influence in a particular community or region to really step up and say, this is not correct, or, this is the correct information, don't, calm down, that was something that wasn't true that was spread. There also has been some work done by organizations such as Fondation Hirondelle, which is based in Lausanne, and they really work with radio stations. So radio stations in sub-Saharan Africa, which have been traditionally the way that people got news in their communities. But now increasingly, we're seeing, smartphones and a younger generation starting to take a lot of that space. So what is the relationship with that? And how can, for example, something that starts to go viral on social media be something that then can be responded to by traditional media? And they've done some very interesting work on that. So it's, a way of trying to use what has been traditionally trusted media to respond to or counteract something that may be going viral on a social media platform. But it also just boils down to education, as we were saying, and being, first of all, smart consumers of information, having a reflex to check information, even if it sounds like you're sure it's true, but maybe it sounds a little bit too good to be true, or it's a little bit, and to have that reflex and go, well, wait a minute, let me just look maybe at a trusted newspaper with a good reputation, or to try to find out, like, if it's written by somebody, does that person really exist? There's the basic things that you can do very quickly to check the veracity of a certain posting. And then more generally, to have those kind of skills to be able to respond to the information. And then it goes down to, if you have divisions in a society, this can go to many more fundamental societal economic elements that are more complicated to address, and something that policymakers then need to look at. So this is a little bit when we try to put the feedback to them, saying, one of the reasons that, for example, this post took root and went viral in the society is because of these conditions that need to be responded to. But, then that's a much longer and bigger process. But there are things that, as I was saying, there's kind of first that reflex to check the information, to have a little bit of skepticism when you're reading things, to not just believe it, forward it without taking a minute or two to double check and say, is this really true?
Yeah. And I think it's great to hear partly your semi-optimism around that. You say there are ways, and it's partly, again, human-centered, where it's about the trust, how trustworthy is someone, can someone of authority in terms of respect and trust in the wider population, just can speak out. And I think I can follow you, and I want to follow you when I look at kind of, partly the traditional media, but also kind of now modern media where it's text-based, where you have an idea, you read it, you commit to devoting your time to it, and you probably then also engage hopefully your thinking capacity to say, is that possible? Should I check it? Does it sound too good? And especially before I share it.
Yes.
If I now look at recent developments around AI, if I look at something where it's not, okay, even if we have a troll factory, we have hundreds of people employed to share fake information, misinformation, it still depends on human capacity. If I now upscale that with AI and maybe move away from text-based to more picture, something where I don't commit to it, but I see it while scrolling through something, while flipping through YouTube or something else, and where probably the checking is much harder or much more time intensive, much more tech savvy intensive, and where probably the amount is much higher, where I think some of the pictures might come out where I say, okay, if I see Angela Merkel with a bikini and a cigar holding hands with Orban on the beach, I probably see, oh, that looks funny maybe, but that's probably fake, but it can be much more subtle. And where I think, okay, there I must say, really, I'm a bit scared of that development. At the same time, okay, if I'm scared or not, it doesn't really matter. That's what's going to happen. That's where AI is probably going, and the technical capacities are there, and the development is quick. So is there anything where you see, okay, what does it mean for your work? You said we try to anticipate development and then react to it in a not too gloomy way.
Well, on that point, it was actually a couple of years ago that we met with certain policymakers and within Switzerland and also some other European countries to say, hey, AI is coming and it's going to have profound implications for society, for employment, and then, for social cohesion. And I will say that the reactions that were a little bit like, oh, really? Or and that is something that can be a problem if you are an organization that is identifying and saying and anticipating something that's not there yet. It can be really challenging to get then those who are, say, decision makers or policymakers on board to really see that vision. However, since basically December last year, so, December, say 2022, we're talking in very, very short period of time, we've seen incredible developments. And this is starting to change, I think, people's opinions, and especially those in parliament, as well as in, say, at the government level. So I'm hoping, and I'm seeing that there are a lot of reactions. Certainly, we see also at the European level, real efforts to come up with different standards for AI. The US has something that is not quite as developed, but has some similar characteristics in terms of trying to set some kind of limits for what it should be used, how it should be used. Also, China has actually a new regulation that went into effect shortly ago, maybe a couple of months ago or end of summer. So these are efforts to try to start to build at least some standards and some limits for, how do we use this technology responsibly? But the evolution is just so fast. And even since, the first ChatGPT came out at the end of 2022, the advances in that have been exponential. I mean,
Yeah,
really,
yeah.
the abilities of it to generate text, to create images that are, I mean, amazing, I have to say. And I like
Yeah,
to,
yeah.
I love to play with this stuff, but also, of course, this raises red flags for how this could be used irresponsibly, let's say, or,
Yeah.
for disinformation, misinformation. So again, I think it does boil down to some very basic things of us also as being consumers of information, having that kind of skepticism and having that reflex to not just take something hook, line, and sinker when we first see it, to really have a reflex and say that may not be true, or that may really be an exaggeration, or that may be really distorting the facts. So I will say this to any parliamentarians out there or policymakers: this needs to be part of our education curricula, really from the early ages, but even for us older folks, it's something that I think, just being a responsible user of these technologies, that we should just have some basic, they call it often cyber hygiene, which is not a very sexy term, but
I agree.
have some basic cyber, reflexes. I mean, maybe
Yeah.
cyber reflexes is the right one, because so that we are not making it much worse. And we users do often make it much worse. So we could be better users and consumers of this amazing technology, which
Yeah.
has also so much potential to really, help us and solve problems and make some of the work that we do much more effective.
The new aspects of scalability, speed, and very often low investment in terms of the distribution doesn't cost extra, so to speak.
Right, right.
And I think there's huge potential, as you said, for good, but there's also huge potential for harm. Probably now, from having started with kind of this some of the very basics, with the blurring line between, let's say, the kinetic world and the online world, and with the blurring lines between combatants and non-combatants, and we look at the war in Israel, Palestine at the moment, in Ukraine, in other places all around, which get less media attention. What do these developments mean in terms of safety and security for civilians in armed conflict? And how do we make sure that some of the upcoming threats, by also civilians being more and more engaged in verifying atrocities, documenting war crimes, by civilian platforms being used for documenting movement of armed troops, of combatants? What does it mean to someone like you, who has 20 plus years in the humanitarian law background and the protection of civilian close to your heart?
Well, it makes it a lot more complicated.
Really? Anne-Marie.
So I know that's really revelatory, but to start off on very basics, international humanitarian law, which is the law of armed conflict, it's based on a fundamental distinction between those that are participating in hostilities and those aren't. And traditionally, though, persons participating in hostilities would be combatants. They would be members of the state's military armed forces. However, there has always been the awareness that you would have sometimes people who were not part of the state organ participating in hostilities. So international humanitarian law does recognize that. And it says that for so long as a person is participating directly or directly participating in hostilities, they lose their protection. That means that they can be attacked. But so what does that mean in the cyber world? And this really makes it much more challenging. Those laws obviously were developed during a time when war was on the ground primarily, and people were just physically firing on each other or defending things. And so we have laws that were very much designed for kinetic warfare with people that were in proximity with each other. I mean, now you can have somebody that is across the globe firing, operating a drone and firing and literally and still and participating in hostilities. So what does that mean? And what does that mean on that person's protection? We also have misinformation, disinformation that can communicate erroneous things about the battlefield, that can try to fake something or confuse the situation. This can be interpreted under certain provisions of international humanitarian law. And then you also have people who they're not part of the military, but they're sending back pictures of enemy, vehicles that are coming into their area and sending them back to their government, saying, hey, they're over here, or, communicating in that way. And so what does that mean? And so this very much blurs the kind of distinction, the fundamental principle of the distinction between non-combatants and combatants. And in terms of what is their protection, can they be fired upon, and what kind of fire does that? Is it a physical fire, or is it some kind of cyber attack? These are things that are still very much under discussion. And the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, has been working in this area. They have actually put out some quite interesting reports recently, including one on rules for hackers in armed conflict.
The eight rules for hackers and four responses by states or something along those lines. Yeah.
And so, so now this is really coming into the discussions, but just to say that it does make it complicated. We try to translate what a cyber attack means to say, how does it stack up to a kinetic attack? And if we're talking about in an armed conflict. And there's something called the Tallinn Manual, Tallinn 2.0. This is a manual that was developed by law professors to try to translate some of these things to the international law space. So from this, if we look at cyber attacks and cyber incidents, how do we translate that into international law? And one of the things that it has included is kind of the scale and effects test. So if a cyber attack is at a scale and has similar effects to a kinetic attack, then it could be considered on the same scale as a kinetic attack. However, in practice, this is something that's very, very hard and has almost never been officially recognized as such. Yeah, and there are probably a lot of reasons, including political reasons, to not recognize cyber attacks on the same level as a kinetic attack. But it does leave kind of a gray zone. So when would attack meet that? So we're in very much a transition place. And I am glad now that the ICRC is really looking at this more, because I have a fear that the protections and the frameworks that we've put in place to try to make things that are as horrible as war as humane as possible, or to protect our human rights, even in a non-conflict situation, are being blurred, are being weakened by the fact that we now have this new kind of way to attack or have incidents that's not being fully recognized by international law. I think we need to go further than writing articles and manuals and some type of exercise to really where we have a much more formal state recognition that certain types of behavior are under international law prohibited.
Yeah.
But this is sort of happening, but not very quickly at the international level. But this is something that we've been advocating for a while. There are a couple of initiatives. One in particular that I think is interesting is the one that was led by the Swiss government and the ICRC, known as the Montreux document. It's a much longer title, but I'll call it Montreux document. And this was an exercise to just the private actors that at that point were participating much more in the context of armed conflict, so private security and military companies, to try to understand what are states' obligations in relation to these actors in the context of an armed conflict, and how would some of the existing international legal provisions, could they be translated for these actors and for what the state's responsibilities would be? And so I think this was not a treaty, but it is a document that has now been recognized by, I think, somewhere around 60 governments that say, we understand our obligations under international humanitarian law to be in line with this document. So it's a kind of formal recognition without going through a whole treaty process, which frankly would take years and probably would be politically almost impossible at this point. So having something that's a little bit more, nevertheless, structured, recognized, and endorsed by states, I think would be good. But I don't think we're there yet. And unfortunately, with the current political climate, it's quite challenging.
and probably, also looking into the future, it's not that you think it's going to get much better within the next couple of years. You mentioned the ICRC a few times, and they have some great resources out also in relation to civilian protection, hybrid warfare, mixed threats. I think it was less than 2 weeks ago, there was something on protecting civilians against digital threats, something along those lines. Great podcast, really worth listening to. And you just mentioned an article also from the last 2 or 3 weeks, I think, or 4 weeks, on, again, I don't recall the title. I think it was 8 tips for ethical hacking and
I don't have
four recommendations states need to rein them in, or something along those lines.
Yeah.
Again, great reading, and I can highly recommend that. But probably moving on from that, you just mentioned state responsibilities, responsible behavior of state players and states in regards to cyber domains. And at the same time, you said, good, we have these big players. We probably have, I don't know, the USA, China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and 1 or 2 other players, North Korea, as being probably really dominant in the sphere. At the same time, at the moment, diverging fractions where cooperation is not really likely. Just if we look at ChatGPT, within a year, exponential growth and use and potential and threats, and we know legal processes can take decades. How can you bring that together, and what would be your main demands in regards to responsible behavior of state actors? We're looking at state actors in regards to what we've been talking about.
Well, to go a little bit on what we talked before, we need to approach this in a different way. We have to have, I'm not entirely sure how it is. I mean, I have some ideas, but we are now in an era where major changes in technology are happening at a rate and speed and a scale and complexity that the traditional processes, coming up with a draft treaty over how many years and then finding consensus and getting enough people on, enough. Anyway, so this is something that takes years, if not decades. And then if we're talking decades, by the time something would get into effect, obviously, at least done in a traditional way, would be outdated. So I think this means we need to think, how do we approach this? And I would say there's a 2-step process. First of all, we already have a huge body of international law in a number of areas that were developed not with cyber in mind, but that could be understood or interpreted to take into account the new advances in cyber. Because even if they are new, they do nevertheless fall into some similar categories: harm, violation of human rights, attacking installations. And for example, with so many of our critical infrastructure installations now being controlled by basically computers and being vulnerable to cyber attacks, before it was not online and connected, but you could bomb it. Now you can attack it and bring it down and make it not functional and have still catastrophic results. So this is this kind of process of translating how this new level of technology is impacting us, but nevertheless having similar, effects and scale to things that we had before technology. So I think there's this whole process of really understanding and translating existing international law. What does it mean now in the cyber era? And not to pretend that we have nothing, that we're starting with a blank slate and we have no idea. And there is work being done on that. It's one of the things that the UN Open-Ended Working Group, which is working towards this responsible state behavior in cyberspace, is encouraging states to do. And also civil society has been very vocal. We would like states to put out opinions on how they think international law applies to cyberspace. Increasingly, states have done this. Somewhere close to 40 states that have put out opinions, how they see the international law applies to cyberspace. And there's just really excellent, I'll just plug one by Costa Rica that came out a few months ago, which I think had a very good, very innovative approach to how we should look at international law applying, and then what that means for state responsibility. So that's happening.
Oh, cool. Yeah. I'm going to check that out.
Again, really good. And there is work being done at the state level, and there are some states that are really moving forward. The challenge is, especially now with all of the different conflicts that we have and the tensions on the geopolitical side, is to have some type of consensus among states. And these processes, the current one, for example, on Open-Ended Working Group, there's also a cybercrime convention process. They operate on the basis of consensus. And so not a voting up and down or majority, minority, everybody needs to be on board. So while I absolutely agree with consensus, it also means that things are moving very slowly and it's often difficult to find consensus. So again, keeping in mind that these processes, the traditional ones, are slow and also very difficult depending on what's happening on the geopolitical scene, I would say. And nevertheless, these technologies are happening every day and they're increasing every day. They're evolving every day. They're having new impacts every day. I would advocate for kind of, first of all, a baseline of standards that we can use to compare the impacts of technology. Is it impacting my human rights? Is it causing me harm? Is it damaging a critical infrastructure, something that or even just something that's more fundamental? Like these are things that like very fundamental standards for like the negatives and the positive aspects of technology that we can evaluate. Maybe set up some type of body. There's been calls to set up a platform at the UN that would be helping to implement this kind of notion of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. And it also notes the important roles and responsibilities of non-state actors. And I mean, that's one thing that has to absolutely be kept in mind, because the non-state actors, they are the ones that are owning most of this technology in the infrastructure, including all the cables that undersea and, the satellites that we're getting our internet on, as well as developing it. So they have a kind of what we would call in international law effective control over this domain. And so they absolutely should be involved. And then also, I think very important to have academics who are researching, who are looking at this technology from a research point of view, who can also identify new developments and maybe help make us aware of the things that are coming around the corner. And then also importantly, the civil society perspective that can really bring in the viewpoint of the users, the ones that are using this every day, who are being impacted, who maybe they're being attacked, or maybe their money's been taken out of their bank, or their identity has been stolen, or there's so many things that are happening from the user point of view. And I think that needs to be kept in mind as well. So if we could have a body that had some kind of agility that could react more quickly, and including in that also very technical perspective. So one group that I think is very important to keep in mind are the CERTs and CSERTs, the Computer Emergency Response Team or Computer Security Incident Response Teams, which most states have at least one or more. And these are the guys and gals who are the first responders when you have an attack. They're the ones that will go in and say, okay, what is this attack? And try to dissect it, try to come up with a patch or a response so that it's not, threatening. And of course, this is a very, very important group as well. So if you could have a platform that really reflects those different perspectives in cyber, because all of those perspectives are important for its functioning, and then could respond more quickly when we're having cyber threats. I think we need to go that way, something more than having some type of treaty that in 30 years maybe goes into effect, and then who knows how worthwhile it is.
By that time, tech will have overtaken and rewritten the treaty. I like your thinking, and I hope that all the heads of states and ambassadors to the UN who are currently listening to that podcast, and I fully assume they do, that they take that idea up. I really like it also with your idea of saying, yes, obviously it's something which is probably driven by state actors, but we need to have civil society on board. And in terms of the big companies, and yes, here we all know the obvious suspects, but also in terms of ordinary users from age groups, minorities from various places around the planet, and saying, what does it mean in people's day-to-day lives? Because as you said, opting out is not an option anymore. It's not that you actually have a choice of not being part of the digital domain to some degree or another. And even if you somehow would manage to, it would still impact your life in terms of everything that's happening around you. Anne-Marie, with an eye to my watch, it's always a real pleasure talking to you. And unfortunately, we don't have these opportunities too often. But we dwelled a lot on some of the threats, and I think it's really important, and the risks and so. But you also put in every once in a while the opportunities, the joy, the potential. Let's probably, for the last remaining minutes, shift our focus and say, okay, if you look at your work, you know the tech side, you're really involved with politicians, you know some of the implications for violent conflict all around the world, the ones which get all the media attention and the ones which are forgotten, which are probably more simmering. What are some of the things that really make you hopeful? What are the things where you see positive potential for peace building, for conflict transformation, and the wider social justice movements?
Well, I think there are more and more people are coming online. The international community is becoming more and more inclusive, and this is something that we're really working towards. So that's one of the things that makes me hopeful. We can really make this cyber space the kind of community that's place that we had. I know 20, 30 years ago when it was first coming out, there were so many of us who were hoping that this could be like the new digital commons.
Can I just cut in? Because I'm also a great fan of the idea of the commons. And at the same time, at the moment, I think a really thought-provoking new book by Varoufakis, former Greek finance minister. And he also looks at this enthusiasm 20 years ago about having the internet as a new international participatory commons with egalitarian principles. And he just put a book out, which I think is called Techno-Feudalism, where he says, unfortunately, we move towards a new feudal society. And obviously, he's playing around a bit with provoking things, but there's some really good thinking in there and worth thinking about. But
Well,
sorry
no,
for cutting in. That was just me on a sidetrack.
Precisely because of that. How do we move out of that space, and how do we get more to some of that more optimistic, more like we're all in this together thinking, which is something that we are working towards, and we're still trying to make happen. And there's one project that we just finished, finished the first part of, which I think also provides some room for optimism. So we worked with the Francophone organization, the OIF, Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, to work with them to together develop some recommendations for how to implement a digital strategy that they adopted at the end of 2022. And so this is really pointing to how do we make the internet and cyberspace more open, more accessible, not just from like a technological and development point of view, but also from a linguistic and culture point of view. And, English is certainly the dominant language on the internet, but there are lots of other languages and lots of other, content and cultural traditions that could be made, say, more available or more findable. And so this is something that we are working towards to really make it inclusive so that you can go in, you can participate, you can have the resources that you're looking for, the experiences that you're wanting. It can also be, music or film or any kind of things online available in your own language, available from your own culture, bringing that to evidence. And it's just something an exercise that needs to be done. It may not be the best in terms of profits, but trying to make this a space where more and more people can participate in a way that's meaningful for them, or they can share within their own cultures and see their own cultures and their own traditions reflected. So this is one thing that gives me hope. And I also see more and more communities and sectors taking a look and going back to what we said earlier, not just saying, oh, I know I'm just using this technology without any kind of consciousness or awareness of taking into account security concerns or where this might be invasive. And so, for example, we have a project that we're working under a Swiss mandate to develop guidelines for those companies that are using ICT's information communication technologies in the provisions of different kinds of security services, and how to do that in a responsible way, a human rights respecting way. So the more and more of the communities that are using these technologies, and we are all pretty much using these technologies, the more and more that we are aware of how to use them responsibly. There are a lot of things also that, for example, minimize the kind of information that we're collecting, not just collect everything, not just hoover everything up because we can, but actually to set limits on it, to be aware of how much we store it, what are the security things. That doesn't sound very exciting. And yet what it can mean is that we can be online and feel safer and not feel that our information is being used in ways that we don't want it to be used. And that, our experience online is something that we get a lot out of, because, there is so much that is possible, especially, and with AI, as scary as it is amazing too. And our new family favorite game is to ask ChatGPT to generate alternative histories. What if something didn't happen? What would have happened? And it's fascinating. It's amazing. Like if you talk about the imagination, the thing to really put yourself in different places to go, it can really facilitate that. So we're working towards that. And I think more and more users and developers are becoming aware of that aspect. So that's what I hope we will see more and more in the next years, months and years.
Great. I love it. I love it. The moving the idea of the commons more center stage again, exploring, appreciating, and really finding beauty and diversity in terms of cultures and in terms of languages and accessibility, but also touching our own nose, as we say in Germany, by being more aware of our own responsibility as the end user, where that is possible, and looking at something where maybe it's not just profit driven, but where it's also joy driven and, let's say, the innocent side of a beautiful creative craziness, and playing around with it to stimulate creativity and motivate us to explore new areas. I really like it. Great. Anne-Marie, you bring such a wealth of knowledge, experience, connections, and just creativity to the table. So I would like to tease you, and I do that with all my guests on the podcast. If you can recommend any resource in relation to digital peace building, emerging technologies, and conflict or peace, which is from beyond your own work. And I know your own work is thrilling and you're really passionate about it, but if you look beyond your work, your organization, is there anything you would like to share with the audience?
Well, as I mentioned before, the ICRC is doing a lot of fantastic work in this area. And I think that these are the kinds of ways that we need to look at this technology and really look at through the traditional lens of law and policy, but then what does that mean? How do we translate it? In terms of like what's exciting and there's so many different uses for this technology in a creative way to make it more accessible and more open to different cultures, and really valuing that. So I think that's going to be a big priority for the next months and years. And as I mentioned, the OEF is really looking at this as a way, not just for the French language, but actually going beyond the French language and different languages, different cultures, different dialects, to making it more open, more accessible to others. And I would just say, if we look at the spaces such as the new AI developers, OpenAI in particular has been quite innovative. They're coming up with some incredible products in terms of art, music, video, creativity. We just also need to keep in mind, and there is work that's being done also by OpenAI, also by the UN, also by some different governments, to try to use this technology in a responsible way. So that's the emphasis. This can be amazing as long as we have a little education on how to use it responsibly. And we all have that responsibility as well. But, these companies that are developing it have maybe a little bit more responsibility than just as users. So, again, we have to have that balance, but there's just tremendous potential out there if we can keep it in balance.
Yeah, and just listening to you, and I did 2 recordings yesterday where we briefly touched about similar topics. I think I should try to get someone who has a lot of experience about digital literacy for all age groups, maybe on the show, and get some really practical ideas for educators all around the planet, for parents, for teachers, for just anyone. That might be a good idea. Hopefully still for this season. Let me work on that once we're
that
off
would be
here.
Great. I think, as I said, I think it's one of the biggest things. This is powerful stuff. We need to know how to use it.
Yeah, I fully agree. Sometimes I need to chat with others and get out of my little bubble here to actually see the obvious. Anne-Marie, last but not least, where can people find more information about you, your work, your publications? Where should they go and visit?
Well, you should definitely go to ICT4Peace.org. So that's ICT4, the number 4, peace.org, where you can see all of our latest information. And I'm there. Please write us an email, drop us. We have all of our contact information on the site, and I'm very much hoping to continue this conversation with you and many others. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to put the contact details into the show notes. So if people forgot about it again, that's where you find them. Anne-Marie, time is flying. We've already been chatting for an hour, which is a real pleasure, and I think the highlight of my day. Thank you so much. I really hope we can continue that one day, hopefully over a cup of coffee. But if that's not possible, then this online domain probably has to do.
Maybe in VR. So maybe I'll see you next time in our VR, office space or something.
Yeah, my downloadable coffee still is not really exciting, but okay. I'm working on it. Anne-Marie, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure. And thank you so much for taking the time and for sharing such a wide, interesting spectrum of information with us.
Thank you, Bjorn. It's been really fun and a pleasure. And looking forward to continuing these conversations.
So much for today. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Make sure you hit the subscribe button so you won't miss out on any of the future episodes. And I would really appreciate if you leave me a rating on iTunes, on Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. If you want to learn more about the Peacebuilding Practitioner, head over to my webpage. That's www.thepeacebuildingpractitioner.org, where you find plenty of articles from practitioners for practitioners. And if you want to dive even deeper into this field of work, join us for one of our online courses. If you want to learn more about that, just get in contact with me. You find the contact details in the show notes or on my webpage.